said the reason they went to children was they wanted to try something new. But when I said to them, are you pedophiles, they were really upset with me. Of course we're not. Of course we're not. We prefer sex with adult women. Of course, the obvious thing is they're all in prison for raping children, but I didn't sort of point that out, that you are actually in prison for raping children. And what was so interesting was, listening to them talk about how, for them, a lot of them said, very interesting, they said the first time they got child porn was accidental. They joined these file sharing sites where they send thousands and thousands of images. And they said the first time they clicked on and child porn was in there amongst all the other images, they clicked off immediately. This is not for them. And then they started thinking about it, went away, came back. Anyway, the average length between clicking on the child porn and raping a child for these men was 6 months. Okay? So now we're in a whole new world now of non-pedophile men seeing children as potential, reasonable victims of their abuse. And that's something we're going to have to deal with, unless, of course, we're going to have massive child sexual abuse going on.
I thought it was interesting, that law that they changed, was that 2002, you mentioned it.
Yeah, well, what happened was in 1997 in the United States of America, they passed a law called the Child Protection Pornography Act. And in it, it says that you couldn't have women under 18 or who looked under 18 in pornography. And in 2002, the Free Speech Coalition, which is the lobbying arm of the porn industry, lobbied the Ashcroft Supreme Court and said that that was too limiting for the free speech of the pornographers, and that they felt that you should be able to have somebody who looked under 18. The Ashcroft Supreme Court agreed, and they changed the law, and now you have had an explosion in what I call pseudo-child porn sites, which is basically sites called, fuckmydaughter.com, Daddy's Little Whore, where she is 18, I'm sure of that, but she looks about 11, 12, 13. And they dress her up in school uniform, so she looks even younger. And now, explosion in those sites. And I document the explosion from 2002 when they changed the law.
It's interesting with that too, because, some of those descriptions are quite revolting, beyond revolting, but it is that sense of two sets of rules, because in your chapter on racism, I thought was really compelling, and it didn't seem rocket science, where you're saying, well, let's look at this porn and it's just so racist and it's sexualising racism, and I think your argument's very compelling in that chapter, because it's very hard to argue against these images. And yet you start that chapter by saying that, is it Don Imus?
Don Imus, yeah.
Yeah, who said, referred to some basketballers as nappy-headed hoes.
Black women, yeah.
And there was a big outcry, sponsorship was withdrawn and he was sacked. Meanwhile, a film was released, Nappy-Headed Hoes. And
porn film, and by Kick-Ass Pictures, a few months later, released a film called Nappy-Headed Hoes, and underneath they said for every movie sold, $1 will be given to the Don Imus Retirement Fund.
And it's when you have that happening in pornography, and yet in the mainstream we still do not accept, that kind of... You cannot say those things. Same with... You cannot, I suppose, actually, although you can't dress someone up as a child and talk about pimping them, but you can get away with that in porn.
You can get away, and this is what's so great about pornography, that it sexualises inequality and violence and renders that violence and inequality invisible. You can get away with stuff in pornography you could not get away with. For example, a very, very popular line of porn in America is called, "Oh no, there's a Negro in my mother, sister, girlfriend." Now, could you imagine having a sitcom saying, "Oh no, there's a Negro in my suburb"? Right? Quite rightly so, they wouldn't allow it. But because it's in pornography, they get away with it. And then what's really astounding is when, I am a left-winger. And I'm proud of being a left-winger. But in America, we've had such a problem with left-wing men who will fight against capitalism, fight against racism, and then are in this very uncomfortable position of having to defend the porn industry. Like, suddenly, and what I say to them is, look, as left-wingers, we all agree that Fox, which is a right-wing radio station or right-wing media, has a real, it's a problem because it manipulates and seduces people into right-wing ideology. But somehow, pornography is the only capitalist enterprise that does not seduce and manipulate its consumers. Every other capitalist does, but not pornography. It's kind of a really bizarre thing that a lot of left-wing men jump through hoops to defend pornography.
And that gets, in terms of solutions, and I think this is always the question with particularly feminist issues, someone always says, what do we do, and what do you... There seemed, you say individual acts are important, but we need a collective.
It's not going to do it.
Yeah, and I kept thinking though. There's obviously there's a huge investment for feminists, all kinds of feminists in pornography, and particularly with something like gonzo porn. You clearly have always been anti-porn, and you do see porn as a cause as much as a symptom of society. When you talk about the cornfield in the Playboy, and it is funny, you do imagine that nice soft lighting.
Yeah,
it's like
of course.
Probably a Winfield ad in the corner.
Coyly smiling.
Everyone's happy. But do you look back and think, would you accept that world now? You know, like, that
world gave birth to this world. Right? You couldn't have had this world without that world. You know, Playboy was crucial because Playboy, and really, you couldn't have started at gonzo pornography. You had to start at Playboy and work your way up to this. Playboy basically, groomed us all for gonzo. It was the key groomer of gonzo, absolutely. And in terms of sort of talking about what's to be done and everything, I mean, what's really interesting, I was reading, something I should never do is read Twitters about myself, and I have been like obsessively, compulsively reading the Twitters, right? And all they're saying is about Gail Dines wants to ban pornography. And I haven't used the word ban because, first of all, as a lefty, right, I have no faith in a capitalist government to ban a capitalist industry, right? It doesn't work like that. And what I would argue is that we need to bring in pornography as a corporation, as a capitalist enterprise, into line with all other enterprises in capitalism, which is give us the right to sue if we can prove harm, which doesn't mean to say it would be really, really difficult to show and to prove harm. But, why not? Why should every other company, right, be limited and not pornography?
How would you do that? Because that is quite...
Okay, well, I'll give you an example. I've got a student whose boyfriend was watching gagging porn, okay? He was watching it. He brought it into the relationship. He insisted on trying it out on her against her will, and he gagged her to the point that she passed out, okay? Well, sue the pornographers, right? For causation, right? It gave him the idea. He would never... I mean, how many men do you think were thinking of gagging their girlfriends before pornography started? Who thought of that? Now, it would be very hard in a court of law, no question. But I like what Catherine McKinnon said. Let's use the courts as our theatre. That's what we would do. And so I would like to try and do that, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny that Catherine McKinnon and Dworkin had actually tried that.
Absolutely, and I brought that legislation to Massachusetts, and what was really interesting was when we tried to get it passed in Massachusetts, the person who was sponsoring it, her aide who was organising all of this, said never in his life had he seen such a concerted campaign to kill legislation. He said never, not even the banking industry, he said, organises like the porn industry. Yeah, it was so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and is this something very specific to the United States, though? Because
absolutely, yeah, litigious society, yeah, no question. I mean, but you know what I love about that idea of the law is we would say to pornographers, hey, you remember that woman you bought for $50? Well, guess what? She's going to cost you $50 million. We don't come that cheap, So it would be a real way to go after them like that, yeah. Make them think twice, because, you have to get the pornographers where it hurts, which is money, because this is, above all, a profit-making machine. So we need to say to them, OK, we're coming after your profits. That's worse than squeezing their balls, trust me, going after their profits.
It is interesting too in terms of sex, because talking about pornography, there's been so much talk in Australia in the last few weeks, and there was a letter in the Green Guide from the other day, which is our TV rag, and someone was really outraged of Q&A that this disgusting stuff had been talked about. It was. I thought, is this satire? It just seemed, or has my great auntie written it? But and I thought it is. We are very uncomfortable, not just talking about porn, but talking about sex. I mean, when you talk about finding an authentic sexuality in that, I think, well. Women don't talk about sex,
no.
and men don't really. And it's not just about porn. And so when you talk about harm, how do you even define sexual harm? And that's a very difficult...
No, I think that's very true. And let's think about it. The most articulate discussion around sex today takes place with the pornographers. I mean, nowhere does sex ed like the pornography do, and that's what they are. They're the biggest form of sex education. And they have kind of controlled the discourse around sexuality. And what I'm trying to do, and which seems to upset a lot of people, is to say, take the discourse away from them and say, what would an authentic sexuality look like? And I don't know. It's not my job. It's not Gail Dines' job to decide what everyone's authentic sexuality is going to look like. It's not my job, basically. But what does it look like to be creative? And people say to me, what about the porn industry and creativity? And I say, you don't look to capitalists to be creative, for fuck's sake. That's not their job, right? Their job is to create an industrial product. You don't go to McDonald's for gourmet food for a very good reason, OK? Don't go to the porn industry for creative sex. That's not where it's going to come from.
That does, though, you know, that analogy, I kept thinking, you know, you think of tobacco industry, alcohol, but also meat industry and food industry, the way you talk about McDonald's. But I do wonder if, you know, like you say in the book, it's a juggernaut. It's huge, and the internet is huge, and they're not going to, you know, that's not going to go away, no matter what women do. I mean, there may be the revolution in so many ways, but no one will agree anyway. So
yes, but we'd figure it out. If we had a revolution, we'd figure it out how to make it work.
Yeah, but in terms of meat, I thought, you know, there's been so much stuff about the food production and meat, and this idea of, well, can we create more ethically produced meat as a compromise to the meat industry, or do we try and get rid of the meat industry? And I wonder in terms of how you know, things could be changed, whether it involves those small incursions or whether you feel that it is possible to, you know...
As a radical, I don't believe that industries within capitalism can be changed. I think they're rotten to the core, right? I thought certain institutions are too rotten to be salvaged. Slavery was one of them. Too rotten, right? You could bring in unions, but it wouldn't work for slavery. It was too rotten. Same with pornography, okay? It's too rotten to the core, it's too corrupt, and it can't be changed. So my argument would be, you know, we have to figure out what an authentic sexuality looks like outside of a corporate, capitalist, industrialised, you know, generic, roboticised imagery that the pornography produces. I mean, that's what's so interesting. Why would anyone put faith in a corporation to have your own interests at heart? I don't get that.
My bank's got my own interests.
Of course.
They care about my home loan. No, okay, thanks, Gail. Well, look, we're going to ask questions now. I'm sure there's thousands waiting to be asked. Now, please limit your questions, because we only have 15 minutes. Actually, technically 13 minutes, but let's live large tonight. And, yeah, not too many statements. So, yep.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you very much for all your work that you've done about pornography, and that you've been prepared to challenge something that's sort of being a bit unchallenged, I think. So I really appreciate that. I also teach at university, and I'm a sexual assault counsellor. I have one issue with one statement you made about the student who came to you, you know, about the boyfriend gagging her against her will.
Yeah.
I would suggest that he committed a sexual assault. So it's not just the porn industry's issue, but I think he needs to take...
No, I completely agree.
But what I wanted to ask you too was, I wanted to get maybe a bit more of a definition from you what you consider pornography, because there's a big... you know, what is pornography for some people is erotica for others. What's erotica for some is not pornography. So I think there's a big debate within that. And I wanted to know, do you see a place also for sexually explicit material? Because some people would argue it's actually supported them in somehow becoming creative in their sex life, learning about sexuality. Do you see a place at all for sexually explicit material that's outside the porn industry, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, first a definition. You know, I always say, you know, when men go in to buy porn, they don't accidentally come out with the Bible. They know exactly what they're looking for, okay? So the men who make it know what it looks like, and the men who buy it know what it looks like. It's just a few academics who seem a little bit confused by the whole thing. So let me say, my definition is very, very simple. If the porn industry calls it porn, if they make it as porn, and if they sell it as porn, that's enough for me. Okay. There is another broader way of looking at it, which is a certain representation of women's bodies. Pornography is a kind of codes of representation, ways of thinking about women, ways of representing it. And when you take that broader definition, what you see is that pornographic ways of representing women's bodies actually filter down into mainstream imagery. So you can turn on MTV, you can look at images, you can watch some of Lady Gaga, and you see how it's informed by pornographic representations of women's bodies. In terms of sexually explicit, yes, I'm sure we have got lots of room for erotic images, for sexually explicit images. And I say, go out and make them. It's just not going to come through the porn industry. That's not the place you're going to find anything. But in terms of creativity and art and the need for images, that's what humans are. We've always had that. And it might be in image form, it might be in print form, all kinds of creative things. Yes, I do see. Absolutely.
Hi, I want to talk about the elephant in the room, which is basically the idea of female purity. And I think that what underpins all of this porn is the socialisation of the depurification of a woman as a valuable thing for a man to do. Okay? So when